6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. The word of the Lord.
All right, you may have a seat. Well, good morning. We are continuing our journey through the book of John. Believe it or not, we are actually past the halfway point in this fantastic book. If you've been here with us for a while, you'll know as we're journeying through the book of John, we're covering almost every single chapter because we really want to explore what John uniquely says about Jesus and how that impacts our lives. And here's what we're saying, that we actually believe something about Jesus, that in fact all these stories, all these chapters, all these verses actually teach us things that we need to go, I believe it's true. And that's an important step of this, is to actually engage what the Bible's saying and to believe further what it's telling us. But it doesn't actually stop there. It continues, and it's not only a belief that we have a mental assent to, but there's an experience, that there's something actually that comes out of that belief that you can experience in your life today and in the coming weeks. Now, today we're talking about generosity, and this is an amazing text of Scripture, but generosity, I'll say, is a bit of a foreign term to us. In fact, we don't typically hear it that often. In our present society, most of the time when you hear the word generous, it has to do with food. Okay? And that's not a bad thing either, okay? But what you'll see is reviews will say they were generous portions. And what do they mean, right? It was a ton of food, like way more than you could finish in one go. Now, as being a recent transplant from Texas, right, there is a motto that Texas has. I'm not sure if Texas has it or others have it for Texas, but regardless, it's the same, which says this, right? Everything is bigger in Texas. Right? In a sense, that's true. There is, way too much, like irresponsible portions of food. But it's not just Texas, actually. It's not just Texas. Did you know that here in New York, there are meals that will rival anything for just scale that you'll get in Texas? Do you know that? Let me tell you one dish that will do it for you. Hot pastrami sandwich. Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about? The hot pastrami sandwich. So my wife and I spent our Friday in a mixture of the Upper West Side, which we've got some people here from the Upper West Side. They tell me it's the best side. I don't know that I agree with that, but we spend some of our time in the Upper West Side, some of our time in our own neighborhood on the Upper East, and we found ourselves last night at the famed Second Ave Deli, which is humorously located on First Avenue. That's right. And when you order the hot pastrami sandwich, this thing comes out, and I tell you, it's more than anyone should eat in a given setting. Okay, I ate it all in one setting, but that's not the point this morning. Okay, but that's not the point I want you to focus on. It's actually that they bring out this ridiculous amount of a sandwich. They also throw like an entire barrel of pickles on your table that's just complimentary. There's a mountain of a vinegar-based coleslaw that even after we distributed it to 5 people at the table, it didn't look like we made a dent. Okay, why do places do something like that? I mean, on a typical meal, you're not consuming 1 pound of protein at a given meal. Most of us aren't. I did last night. Why is that? Because here's what the restaurant wants you to do, right? When they send this thing out, it's over the top for a reason, right? They're being over the top for a reason, because when you see that plate come out and it sets down in front of you, they want you to think it's worth it. That's what they want. There's this moment, right? This over-the-topness that you're going to look at and go, it's worth it. Because generosity is always tied to worth. It always is. There's always this relationship between the two. Not only was last night way too much food at Second Ave Deli, actually this morning I got up early and was blowing up balloons, saying up some different things, because today is my son's 7th birthday. So thank you. I worked hard for that. So it's his 7th birthday, right? And what do we do on birthdays? We go over the top, right? He had bacon and chocolate babka for breakfast, which is basically a candy bar shoved in like a sweet roll. I mean, it's huge amounts of sugar, right? He's got presents, balloons. Why do we do this? Right? Why do we do this sort of over-the-top generosity? Because we want to say, you're worth it. Right? Generosity is always tied to worth. And you know the interesting thing about that is, whenever you find yourself struggling with generosity, it's always tied to worth. And we're going to see that today. And I want us to think in terms today of more than just money. Because actually, the passage we're talking about here wasn't even money per se. It was objects. It was heirloom items. You know what? For some, it could be your relationship. It could be extending relationship to those around you. It could be with your time. It could be with your resources. But when you find yourself going, I don't think I'm living a very generous life. In fact, I think most of my life looks like I'm kind of building a bunch of safety nets. You know, I've got my safety net, and then I've got a safety net for the safety net, and then I have umbrella coverage in case the nets break, you know? And when everything about life is trying to keep as much as you can and give as little as you can in whatever realm, I want you to know it always comes back to this idea of worth. And that if we actually understand what Jesus is saying today, that it will do something in our hearts. It will unlock our hearts in such a way that we can live and experience generous lives. And I tell you, don't you love being around someone who's generous? Don't you love being around someone who it just, not that they're irresponsible, not that they're unthinking, right? Not that they're not planning or balancing books, but I mean someone who just has such a freedom to go, here, why don't you have this? Hey, why don't you come with us? Oh my gosh, you haven't had dinner yet? Come on in. Someone who's got this innocent, open-hearted generosity is an amazing thing. Don't you want to be like that? But we struggle with it. And I want to talk about why. Turn with me this morning to John chapter 12. We're going to be in the book of John chapter 12 this morning. It's a very short story, but it's actually one of the most famous stories in the New Testament. It's one of the few stories that is told across. In fact, when we look at the book of John, the vast majority of the stories and material in John are unique to the book of John. They're not found in the other Gospels. This, however, is a story that's found across the Gospels, including John, but John makes some interesting changes to the story. He tells new details that the other authors chose not to describe, and there's a reason for that. Start with me in John chapter 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Now, let's talk about the setting real quick because that matters for us. First of all, we're told that this is 6 days before the Passover. This is a time for a high Jewish festival. In fact, the city is celebrating one today, Rosh Hashanah, and it's a time of anticipation, of reflection, and preparation, similar to what's happening now in our city, right? It's 6 days out from the Passover for Jesus, and so for Jesus as well as the other religious Jewish community, we're taking time to consider. Consider what? Consider the past, what their lives have been, good or bad, and to prepare themselves, prepare their hearts for what's about to come, Passover, the time where God's judgment has fallen because of the consequences of sin. And so it's a time of reflection, of introspection, a time to sit there and consider where you are at with God. This is on the road to the Passover, which is on the road to Jesus' death. Now, it's 6 days out from that, and actually Jesus is at a dinner party. It says that Lazarus was there. This was who we just read in the last chapter, who was brought back to life. When Jesus, in that amazing moment, said, "Lazarus, come out." And with just a word, life came. This is the guy. And they're celebrating. You have two other characters here. You've got Martha, who's serving, right? We see that often in the text. And Mary is going to be coming up in just a moment here. But they're giving this dinner. And what's this dinner for? This dinner is to just celebrate the amazing resurrection that has just happened. I mean, think about this for a moment, right? If someone in your family died, and you were so close to them, and then Jesus comes in the flesh, and he resurrects them from the dead, don't you think you'd want to celebrate too? And so there's this incredible moment, right, where Jesus invites everybody over and says, Martha and Mary invite people over, and they want to say, we want to just celebrate what God has done. This is not an everyday occasion, okay? This is not just the typical, hashtag typical Tuesday. This is a huge deal. This is an amazing moment, and they're there to worship and praise what Jesus has done. Now, look what happens in verse 3. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment. The ESV uses ointment. No one likes that word. The NIV uses perfume. You can think of it like a pungent oil. And this was made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, this is an incredibly controversial moment, and it's hard for us to understand what it is without understanding kind of the economics of the situation. So here is this special celebration, right? Not only is it coming towards Passover, this time of reflection, of consideration of what God has done, but actually God has shown up in an amazing way in this family's life. And they're there to celebrate it. They're there to just respond with praise to God. And while you have Martha, who's there, and she's serving. You've got Lazarus, who's there, and he's celebrating. Here comes Mary. And Mary comes in. If you compare this with the other gospel narratives, there's this alabaster box, which was something that contained and kept it fresh. And then there's this jar of ointment. Now, it's called nard or spikenard in some of your translations. It actually comes from a plant that grows in the Himalayan mountains. And it grows either in northern India or up further into the mountain range. And it only grows at about 9,000 feet or higher, okay? So suffice it to say, it's an incredibly rare plant. And it comes up about a meter high. And you would go and they would traverse up into the mountains. They would find these plants and they would carefully pull out the roots, because if you took the roots and you mashed them up, you could extract a certain amount of oil from these roots. It's like a dark amber color. It's pretty viscous, and it had a very pungent, earthy sense. In fact, if you really want to impress your friends, you can actually buy pure nard through, I think doTERRA sells it now, right? You can actually buy it today. Back then, it was incredibly difficult and dangerous to get, and then on top of it all, to transport. In fact, this was one of the most valuable oils that they had. It was used in everything from, you'll read in your Bible, it was used everything from ceremonial offerings in the temple. It's used to talk about an intense motion, an attractive moment in Song of Solomon. In Upper Egypt, they would use it as perfumes, and the Romans would use it as expensive gifts to pass back and forth to wealthy clientele, right? This was an incredibly valuable substance. Most people had not seen it. Most people had never smelled this before, right? Wildly expensive. And here in the middle of this dinner party, you have Mary who comes out, right? This alabaster box, you open it up and pull out this jar, and it's sealed, and she actually breaks the jar. And she anoints Jesus with almost a pound of this oil. Now, who here has ever been around really strong essential oils? Anybody? You know what's true about essential oils? How much is too much? Almost any amount, right? Almost. It's so strong, right? It's such a strong scent. Here comes this woman, right, with this jar. Incredibly expensive. In fact, the text tells us that it was a year's worth of income. 300 denarii. 300. A denarii wasn't an amount as much as it's about what you made in a day. All right, so 365 days in a year. You take off the Sabbath and a couple other religious holidays. That is an entire year's worth of salary. Think in your mind, don't say it out loud. Think in your mind for a moment, what is my annual salary? Now imagine that in a jar. And you break that open and you put it on Jesus' feet. Shocking. Absolutely shocking. Not only is it shocking, it's completely, wildly over the top. How much would it take just to make the room smell nice? How much? Not a pound. A couple of drops, breaking the jar, and with a glug, 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 a year's worth of income spills all over Jesus onto the floor, soaking into the rug. Incredible. Extravagant. Wildly, unnecessarily over-the-top generosity. It was completely shocking. I have to imagine everyone in the room was kind of holding their breath in this wide-eyed moment where people don't even know what to say. Incredibly generous, extravagant, over the top. How long do you think that oil lasted? Think about this for a moment with me. If they put that on Jesus, how long do you think he smelled like that oil? Just take a guess. Maybe a couple days, maybe less. A year's income gone in a wild, over-the-top gesture that probably lasted less than 36 hours. Now, my business people in the room, this is where you start ticking off the ROI box, right? You know ROI? What is your return on investment here, right? This was an annual salary, right? It went for this purpose. Most of it was frankly spilled on the ground, and it only lasted an hour. What's the return on investment in that? What is it worth? Because generosity is always tied to worth. Not only was it just economically extravagant, although it was in a shocking way, it also was culturally extravagant. Because here's what Mary did, right? She actually gets down on her hands and knees and she undoes her hair. That was very culturally inappropriate at the time, right? Your hair stays up. To have it undone would either only be in a home setting or it would be in this incredible moment of servitude. She actually undoes her hair and wipes Jesus' feet with her hair. Wildly inappropriate. I cannot even imagine how intense and uncomfortable the people in that room felt. Have you ever been in the room where someone is doing something so culturally inappropriate and it makes you feel like, oh my gosh, where's the exit? Like I have to get out of this place. I'm telling you, this is that moment. This is the moment. And it's not just that the fact she's using her hair, right? In a lot of Eastern cultures, so I lived in Japan for a year and some change. I lived in Seoul for a few months, and I've been to Thailand a lot. You know what's really interesting in Thailand when you're at a restaurant? right? You got to be careful that you don't sit down and cross your legs like this. Does anyone know why? Because the bottom of your foot, your feet are considered the least honorable part of your body. And when you sit down and you have your legs up like this, it's like you're pointing it at somebody, and whoever that somebody is, it's kind of like you're insulting them. In fact, when you go into temples in Thailand, they have these little signs that say, do not show your feet to the Buddha. You ever seen these? Anyone ever seen those? Right? Don't take pictures. Don't show your feet. Why? Because they believe this, right? Your head is the most honorable part of your body. The feet, the lowest part, is the least honorable part of your body. Now think about what she's doing for a moment. She's taking her hair, what is considered her glory, that is hidden only for those who are closest. She actually lets it down in public and starts taking the most honorable part of herself to wipe the least honorable part of Jesus. What is she saying? That there is nothing that is not worth honoring Jesus with. Right? Shocking. And the crowd is sitting there and going, this is economically absurd. Right? This is completely, wildly over the top. It is not just economically ridiculous. It is culturally outrageous what she is doing. Look at the response of what happens. Verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, by the way, you're in bad company when you're agreeing with Judas, okay? This is just a little promo here. Verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Now, here, I tell you, it's very easy to sympathize with Judas in this situation, right? He sits there and he sees this over-the-top extravagance, and he looks at it and he goes, what an incredible waste. Did we just see this happen? Are you kidding me? Are you looking at what's going on here? Why wasn't this given to the poor? Now, look what he's actually thinking behind those words. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and having charge of the money bag he used to help himself to what was put in it. See, Judas was the bookkeeper. He was the accountant. And whenever money would come in, Jesus' ministry was supported by different individuals, by a group of women actually were frequently supporting Jesus' ministry. They would give money. And it seems to imply that a very common practice was of whatever was received, part of it was given to the poor. Right? And Judas kind of is using this to hijack the situation. And because as some of the money comes in, Judas is kind of fixing the books on this one. Right? Whenever this amount comes in, I'm just going to take a little bit and put it in my pocket. And when he sees this oil go down on the ground, he's reminded of, what a waste. I could have had some of that. You know what's so fascinating about this, right? If you take away the whole fixing the books and cheating and stealing money from Jesus, okay? Hopefully that's not where you're at today. If you take that part away from it, I wonder how many of us in that moment probably would have thought the same things, maybe not for the same reason, but that you would have thought the same thing, because here's the deal. It's not pragmatic, okay? This is incredibly not pragmatic. In a lot of ways, it doesn't even seem to make sense, because we sit there and go, I mean, we love Jesus, right? But let's talk about long-term return on investments. I mean, that lasted for how long? Hours? Do you know how many people you could have fed with that? I mean, don't we care about the poor? Don't we care about, those who are in need? I mean, doesn't Scripture talk about God has a heart for the fatherless? And you can kind of feel the tension of that, right? Look at what Jesus says here. Jesus says, leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Now, in some ways, right, if you take off the hat, okay, Jesus is Jesus and he's right, and we have to go, yes, Jesus is right. If you take that hat off for a moment, doesn't it kind of feel a little harsh? Jesus saying, hey, the poor are always going to be with you. This is something special. So in this scenario, two people, they both look at Jesus. A jar of expensive ointment is broken. Two people look at it and they go, is he worth it? For Mary, the answer was yes. For Judas, the answer was no. You know, there's something about generosity that challenges us, right? I gotta give you a heads up on this. If you take this seriously and you actually go, you know what? I hope that at my funeral, if the Lord doesn't return and I'm there at my funeral, and if I could kind of hover around like the body over Lazarus for 3 days, that didn't actually happen, but if I could kind of be in the room, you know, I hope that people would say, what an incredibly generous person. They live such a generous life. Wouldn't you want that said of you? But I tell you, if you do that, it really challenges people around you. Because generosity challenges people, and it can actually offend people in a way that you wouldn't believe. And Judas was incredibly offended by this generosity. Let me tell you a quick story about how this looks like. So I went to college, freshman in Bible school, heading to Bible school, and I have an RA. You guys know what an RA is, the one who's supposed to keep you from burning the dorm down, you know? I don't know who takes those jobs anyway, but so I go in with my RA. I had been saved for quite some time, but in a lot of ways was not as alive spiritually as it could have been. I was a little cold. And I had this RA who I hope he watches this podcast sometime, hearing me tell stories about him. So he had just recently come to Christ, selling drugs not long before. Big change and shift in his life. And he was also a surfer, so that didn't help. But he was just very much like, dude, isn't Jesus just so radical? Oh my gosh, isn't the scriptures gnarly? And it was just coming out all the time, right? And this is Bible school, so what are you going to say? Oh yeah, of course, that's great, you know, it's good. And after a while, you know, I would walk by and I'd sit there and go, you know, how's your morning going? And he'd go, man, how could your day not be great when you're reading the Psalms? You know, it's just one of those things. And you're like, yeah, so I totally agree with you. That's what I was doing in bed too. You didn't see the light, you know. Covers were over. So and I tell you, I probably went a good couple of months thinking, that guy's got to be a fake. That guy's got to be a fake, right? Because no one is that just exuberant about their faith. What choice was I making? Because I had two choices in that scenario. Either he was real, and that passion and worship for God was real, or he was a fake. You know, let me put the question a different way. Either I was real, or actually I was really cold-hearted. Which is easier to say? Man, those guys can't be real. I'm fine. No, my passion for God is fine. My life being changed by the book of Psalms today is fine. He must be the fake. You know what's crazy about this? Generosity will challenge those around you. When you go, God, I just want to praise you and I want to give this to you. For other people who struggle with that, man, it really challenges, because what it does is it says something about them and what they think is worthwhile. And so here's this scenario, right? This incredible, over-the-top, extravagant, unleashed generosity. And it sets off a firecracker in the room of people who are offended, confused, don't understand what's going on. And Jesus says this. He goes at the very end of it, not that Jesus doesn't care about the poor. Jesus cares about the poor. But he says, you know what, the poor you're always going to have with you. But this is a special moment. What was special about it? He's about to go to his death. You know, nard was typically used, one of the uses, it was used for burial. as a way to honor and commemorate the body. They didn't have ways of maintaining cadavers in a certain condition, and so they would cover them with this ointment or with this oil to make them smell good for this time of burial and reflection. This is actually something that was used to prepare bodies for death. And in this amazing mystery of God, that God actually uses this woman to prepare Jesus' body for his death. And here's a lesson I want you to take away this morning. Extravagance is not based on the gift. Extravagance is not based on the gift. It's based on who you're giving it to. Extravagance is not based on the gift. It's based on who you're giving it to. Okay, so if I go and I walk by somebody on the street who has their hand out for money, I give them $100. I tell you what, that's pretty generous, right? Does that seem generous to you? All right, that seems pretty generous, okay? You know, if I'm walking down the street and I give $100 to Michael Bloomberg, how generous is that? I read a statistic actually once about Microsoft and Bill Gates, that actually it would cost Bill Gates, if he were working, more money to bend down and pick up a $100 bill than it would for him to continue doing whatever he's doing at work, right? It's not about the gift. It's about the worthiness of the one you're giving it to. And here's the crazy thing. If you think about it this way, a year's worth of salary wasted. Or if you think of this, God has come to earth in human form. The one who created the very mountains and the seas has come, and he is about to die for you, for all of his creation, that things would be restored, because God is so generous that he has withheld nothing, including himself, for this world. What could you possibly give that would be appropriate to that moment? What could you possibly give the one who created all things? What would be too generous? What would be so over the top? What would be even just enough for the very God who created you and is about to die for you? You see, when you look at it like that, you go, man, I mean, essential oils are nice. But I tell you, it doesn't touch the worthiness of Jesus in that moment. As the worship team comes up, you know what? Generosity is always tied to this belief of worth. And you know, when Mary looked at Jesus, you know what she didn't see? A year's worth of salary. You know, when Mary looked at Jesus, you know what she didn't see? Cultural embarrassment from a room full of people who are going to see her in a way they've probably never seen her. Mary didn't see the rumors that were going to spread around. Mary didn't see the offense and the rebuke that was going to come from selfish disciples. You know what she saw? The one who had brought her brother back from the dead. And the one who would one day bring her back from the dead. What is too much in that moment? What could possibly be worth honoring Jesus in that time? Nothing. I tell you, church, when we come saying, God, would you make us generous people? You know what that comes down to? Looking to a God in heaven who is so generous, he's given all things. And when we see that, it's like it unleashes something in our hearts. It goes, God, you are so worth it. That I'm actually just able to go, hey, whatever it is you're asking for, whatever it is you want, it's yours. Because you are worthy. Join with us as we sing and as we come to the Lord's Supper. I want to remind you, we've got 2 tables here in the front. We've got 2 tables here in the back. If you've put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, we want you to come on up in groups of 4 to 6 to be able to take communion from us and to remind ourselves of this, the incredible, over-the-top, gracious generosity of a God who died for you, who shed his blood, whose body was broken so that you may find life in the face of that generosity, everything else just makes sense. Come join us as we work.